Hello, and welcome to the presentation on the connection between morality and religion. Before viewing this lecture, you should have done the readings. For most sections, these include the Rachel's chapter, the Euthyphro, and Cotton's No Morality Apart from God, though this may vary from section to section. Divine Command Theory. Divine command theory is the theory that morality is determined entirely by the will of a divine being or beings, usually a god or goddess, gods or goddesses. Though the Judeo-Christian tradition has more than 10 rules in their scriptures, the 10 Commandments makes for a convenient example of divine command theory. Under divine command theory, then, what is moral is what God, or gods, etc. commands, and what is evil is what God, or gods, etc. forbid. Using the anatomy we have become familiar with, the theory breaks down like this. Concept of the good is that the good is whatever God, or gods, or goddess, or some other supernatural entity commands. Instead of saying all this each time, I will just use God for now on, but you should keep in mind that whether it is one God or many, or a god or goddess, or spirit, may vary by religion. The justification is often missing and simply taken on faith. The method is to follow those commands. This justification is self-evident. If following the commands is what is good, then following them is how to be good. What has become known as the Euthyphro problem or Euthyphro dilemma asks the question, is a thing good because God says it is good, or does God say a thing is good because it is good? Either way the defender answers the question presents her with a problem. This is why it is called a dilemma. Both options turn out badly. If the defender of divine command theory says that the commandments are good merely because God says they are good, then goodness seems to become entirely arbitrary. The only thing that makes rape, murder, torture, and every manner of vile act wrong under this view is the fact that it is forbidden by God. If God didn't say these things were wrong, they would be permissible. And if God kept everything else in the world the same and yet said rape, murder, torture, and so forth were good, then, if a thing is good merely because God says it is, the defender would have to say that those things would be good. Yet most people would say that they are clearly immoral. On the other hand, if the defender says that God gives the commandments he does because those things commanded are already good things, then there is a standard of goodness apart from God, and it is this which makes an action morally right or not. This would no longer be divine command theory. Rachel says that divine command theory has the following problems. It makes morality mysterious. After all, how can a command make something moral? It makes morality arbitrary. There's no general moral principle guiding commandments, they are just commanded. If there were a guiding principle, then that principle would be what made things good or bad. And it seems to provide the wrong reasons for moral rules. A more detailed account of the Euthyphro dilemma is given in a separate lecture, so if this isn't fully clear to you yet, you will receive more details there. Natural law theory. Another religious view of ethics has its roots as far back as Aristotle, and likely aspects of this view were around even before then. Aristotle believed that literally everything in the world had a purpose, or some end that it was in some way meant to serve. This is called a teleological worldview. When human beings make objects, they do so for a purpose. The purpose of a house is to give shelter, for example, and the purpose of a loom is to make cloth. Under the teleological worldview, the same thing applies to all natural objects as well. For some natural objects, this purpose seems apparent. It seems as if the purpose of the heart is to pump blood, the purpose of the eye is to see, and the purpose of the ear is to hear. Aristotle would take it even further, saying that the purpose of the soil is for plants to take root, the purpose of the rain is to water plants, the purpose of plants is to feed animals, and so forth. Some objects may have multiple purposes. For example, rain may be to water plants, and to give humans fresh water, and to give animals fresh water, and so forth. Wind may be to move ships on the sea, and to transport seeds and pollen. When something was not performing the function it should, it was seen as bad or defective. Like a bad boat sinks, or bad weather kills crops. This view was also very anthropocentric. Almost everything on the earth is for human beings to use. This view of the world was very appealing to Christian thinkers who adopted the view with one major modification, the addition of a deity. I see because God designed them to do so. Rain is meant by God to water plants, and plants are meant to feed animals, and animals are meant by God, along with everything else on earth, to be for our use. So far, this theory just describes how it believes the world to be, but natural law theory goes a step further and moves from being merely descriptive to prescriptive. In other words, natural law purports to say how things morally should be. Major contributors to the theory of natural law, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most prominent figures in Catholicism, believed that God gave us reason, and that by using this reason in combination with observing nature, we can arrive at the major moral truths. He believed that Scripture was necessary for the specifics of Christian doctrine, but even without Scripture, nature should teach us most of the behaviors that are morally wrong and morally right. This made morality available to all beings with reason in any culture. For example, given that we are social animals, we can see that other social animals get along together, so we should not kill one another, and so forth. As Rachel points out, natural law theory has often been used to condemn so-called deviant sexual behaviors, such as masturbation, homosexuality, and oral sex. It was used to condemn these things because it argued that sexual organs are for the purpose of reproduction, so using them for other purposes or in other ways is morally wrong. Objections to natural law theory. There are several objections to natural law theory. First is the objection that the theory seems to assume that what is found in nature is good, yet this seems to clearly be false. Malaria is natural, but it is a disease that causes almost immeasurable suffering. The vaccinations that eradicated smallpox were unnatural, and in fact meant to combat something natural, and yet seem to be good. In spite of this, you will often hear naturalness cited as a virtue, even by non-natural law theorists, and unnaturalness being cited as if that all by itself were a moral defect. This is actually a fallacy called the naturalistic fallacy. The biggest philosophical objection to natural law is Hume's famous point that you can't get an ought from an is. What this means is that you cannot determine what morally should be the case merely by determining what is the case. It is the case that there are still many places in the world where slavery exists. But the fact that slavery exists does not mean that it morally should exist. What is true and what we ought to morally strive for or to make true are two entirely different things. Natural law therefore seems to be making the mistake of assuming that because something is the case in nature, it also morally ought to be the case, and repeated in our behavior. Modern science has largely done away with the teleological, purpose-driven worldview, as well as what might be our anthropocentric biases. Weather patterns are more thoroughly understood as physical systems obeying physical laws, as opposed to the idea that rain clouds exist in order to water plants. The same things can be said of sunlight, the formation of geological structures, and what seems to be all sorts of other major observable phenomena. These things seem to operate by the blind forces of nature and do not seem to have any special care for human beings. An additional difficulty with applying natural law theory, not mentioned by Rachels, is the tremendous variation in nature that Aristotle and Aquinas were largely unaware of. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, to get any clear moral messages from nature. Take the sexual practices of masturbation, homosexuality, and oral sex, which we mentioned earlier as targets for natural law theory. These were often condemned as violating natural law. It is now well known that all three of these behaviors take place in nature, often by those animals that are both genetically and in appearance most similar to human beings. Of course, a reply could be made that sometimes animals use their parts unnaturally as well, but the point is that determining these boundaries can become tricky by observing nature alone. Before closing, it is also worth noting that there are more than two ethical theories based on religion. These two just happen to be among the most common. As always, you should be thinking critically both about the theories and the objections. Can you think of additional objections? Can you think of replies to the objections? Can you think of objections to your own replies? The further you go in terms of your own internal dialogue, the more your critical reasoning skills will improve. Until next week, I'll see you in the forums.